In 1984 Glasgow, a gang war didn't end with rivals killing rivals. It ended with someone pouring petrol outside a family's front door and setting it alight while they slept. 6 people died, including a child, and the men convicted of it would later walk free. In the early 1980s, Glasgow was a city under pressure. Heavy industry had collapsed. Unemployment was widespread, and entire communities in the East End were struggling to survive. Housing schemes like Ruchazie and Easter House were hit hardest. Poverty was entrenched, opportunity was scarce, and heroin was beginning to flood the streets. In these schemes, ice cream vans were part of daily life. Their music echoed through the blocks. Children ran out with coins in their hands. Parents trusted the drivers. The vans were familiar, harmless, almost comforting, but behind that harmless routine, something darker was already forming. By the early to mid-1980s, some ice cream routes were no longer just about selling treats. They became mobile fronts for crime. Vans were used to sell stolen goods and later drugs, moving through schemes under the cover of legitimacy. A van could travel freely, unnoticed, welcomed even. What looked innocent in daylight became something else entirely after dark. Routes quickly turned into territory. Each street meant money. Each scheme meant control. Drivers were told who they could sell to, where they could operate, and who they answered to. Those who refused were warned. Those who resisted were punished. This wasn't about ice cream anymore. As competition grew, so did the violence. Vans were shot at. Windscreens shattered. Drivers were dragged from their vehicles and beaten. Threats escalated from intimidation to outright attacks. Soon, it wasn't just vans being targeted. Homes were marked. Doors were firebombed. Families were dragged into a war they had nothing to do with. Fear spread quickly through the schemes. People stopped talking. Witnesses disappeared. Silence became survival. But the violence was about to cross a line no one expected. What came next would change this from a gang war into a national tragedy. By the early 1980s, Glasgow's East End was divided into invisible borders. Rival groups fought for dominance over ice cream routes, the same way gangs elsewhere fought over drugs or weapons. Control meant money. And money was enforced through fear. Drivers who stepped out of line were dealt with quickly. Some were threatened, others were assaulted, and many simply disappeared from their routes altogether. Word spread fast. Witnesses stayed silent. Neighbors looked away. In these schemes, talking to the police wasn't bravery. It was a death sentence. Officers knew what was happening. They could see the pattern. But every investigation hit the same wall. No statements. No cooperation. No one willing to name names. The streets had closed ranks, but this was only the beginning. The first major escalation came in a series of attacks on the vans themselves. In the early 1980s, ice cream vehicles became moving targets. Firearms were used. Shots were fired directly through windscreens in broad daylight. Petrol bombs were thrown as warnings, not to kill yet, but to send a message. These weren't random acts. Each attack was deliberate, public, designed to be seen. A driver who crossed the wrong people didn't just lose business. He was humiliated, attacked, and marked. Vans burned in the street while neighbors watched from behind curtains. Police later described these incidents as intimidation campaigns, but on the ground they felt like open warfare. Children still chased the music. Parents still waved the vans down. And beneath that normality, violence was tightening its grip. But intimidation wasn't enough anymore. As rival groups pushed harder for control, the violence changed shape. Attacks on vehicles gave way to attacks on people. Drivers were beaten in front of witnesses. Threats followed them home. Routes were no longer the only targets. Families became leverage. The message was clear. This war would not stay on the streets. What happened next would shock even hardened detectives. By the mid-1980s, the conflict had crossed a dangerous line. Violence moved from business to personal. Homes were marked. Doors were targeted. Petrol became the weapon of choice, cheap, effective, and terrifying. Fire wasn't just destructive. It sent a message that lingered long after the flames died out. In several incidents, properties linked to drivers were attacked. Some fires were small, intended as warnings. Others caused serious damage. Each one raised the stakes. Each one pushed the war closer to catastrophe. Families began living in fear. Children slept in clothes, ready to run. Parents listened for footsteps on stairwells in the middle of the night. Everyone knew what the threat meant. Fire didn't discriminate, but this wasn't the worst act of the war. In the early hours of the 16th of April 1984, the violence reached a point from which there would be no return. At around 2 a.m., in Ruchazie, a quiet East End housing scheme, petrol was poured outside a family flat. The accelerant soaked into the close. It crept under the door. Then it was ignited. Inside, the family was asleep. The fire took hold instantly. Thick smoke filled the building. Flames cut off escape routes. Neighbors were woken by screams and the smell of burning. By the time emergency services arrived, it was already too late. 6 people were killed. Among them were James Doyle, his sons Tony, aged 14, and Andrew, aged 18. Also killed were Christina Halloran, just 25 years old, her teenage son James, and her baby Mark, only 18 months old. An entire family was wiped out in minutes. The scale of the tragedy stunned Scotland. This wasn't a gangland execution. It wasn't a targeted hit on a criminal rival. Innocent people had been burned alive in their own home while they slept. News spread quickly. Newspapers across the country carried the story. Politicians demanded answers. Police came under intense pressure to bring someone to justice. Overnight, the ice cream wars were no longer a whispered secret of the schemes. They were front-page news. For many, this was the moment the illusion shattered. The idea that this was just criminal violence contained within the underworld was gone. The war had claimed children. It had crossed every boundary. Investigators described the scene as one of the most horrific they had encountered. Firefighters struggled with the aftermath. Neighbors were left traumatized. The community was paralyzed by grief and fear. And yet, even after 6 deaths, the silence remained. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to be next. This was no longer about territory. Innocents were dead. The pressure on police after the Ruchazie fire was immense. 6 people were dead, including children, and the public demanded answers. Detectives flooded the East End, conducting door-to-door inquiries and reopening old intelligence. linked to the ice cream wars, but fear ruled the schemes. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Many refused outright. With little forensic evidence, investigators were forced to rely heavily on statements and testimony. Eventually, 2 men were arrested and charged in connection with the fire. Prosecutors built their case around witness accounts and expert evidence presented as conclusive. At trial, both men were convicted of murder. Each received a life sentence. For the public, it appeared justice had finally been served. The case was closed. The ice cream wars, it seemed, had claimed their last victims, but the case was far from over. Years into their imprisonment, serious doubts began to emerge. Lawyers challenged the reliability of key testimony. Expert evidence that had helped secure the convictions was re-examined and found to be deeply flawed. Allegations of police misconduct surfaced. Appeals were lodged. Each challenge took years to work its way through the courts. The legal battle dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Families waited. Campaigners pushed for reviews. Slowly, the foundations of the original trial began to crumble. Eventually, the case was referred back to the appeal court. In 2004, the convictions were quashed. The judges ruled that the trial had been fundamentally unsafe. After serving close to 20 years in prison, both men were released. No one else was convicted for the murders. The deaths of 6 people remain one of the darkest chapters in Scottish criminal history. A gang war exposed, innocent lives destroyed, and a justice system that, for many, failed to deliver final answers. The ice cream wars ended in silence, not resolution. What began as greed and control ended in the deaths of innocent people. A hidden war spilled into family homes, leaving scars that never healed. Decades later, justice remains incomplete, and the truth still fractured. Some crimes don't fade. They just wait in silence. The events described in this video are based on publicly available information, court records, and news reports. All individuals mentioned are considered innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. This content is presented for documentary and educational purposes only.